Hey, we're going to get started. I'm Greg Lyman. My grandfather was Lynn Lyman. Deseret News, before he died, did a full-page article on him, calling him Mr. Hole in the Rock. He led 50 expeditions in jeeps, well, originally on horses, donkeys, whatever, mules, to the Hole in the Rock. I just wanted to, I invited Lamont to speak to some youth at a youth conference at Utah State years ago, and he electrified these kids, so you're in for a treat. I was going to tell Lamont that I found all of my grandfather's slides, so come over and we'll go through them and you'll find some images of the Hole in the Rock that have never before been seen in decades. So I give you, he's an electrical engineer, a former bishop. He has 18 grandchildren, four or five children. He has done more for the cause of educating the public about the Hole in the Rock and honoring those pioneers than anyone I know. So I give you Lamont Crabtree.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I can't see you, so I assume you can hear me. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to, a lot of this is review from many of you, but I'm going to walk through some of the challenges they faced on the journey, and in particular the challenges that Platt D. Lyman faced as he was called upon to become the primary leader of the journey at a very young age of 32. Here there were members of the journey twice his age. And what a remarkable experience this must have been for him. Just to put things in perspective, I know all of you are familiar with the Hole in the Rock, and it's a bit intimidating to talk about the Hole in the Rock to the Lymans. I usually ask if there are any descendants or anyone in the audience that have connections to the Hole in the Rock journey. And I'm always at ease if there aren't any, because then it doesn't matter what I say, nobody knows any better. But I know that's not the case today. But to help put this journey in perspective, I don't know that we fully appreciate the difficulty of the journey. Now, I don't want to compare this to things like the Willie Handcar Company, because from a standpoint of the loss of life, they did not experience anything like that. But from a standpoint of the difficulty of the journey, the length of the journey, it took them 3 times longer to go from Parowan to Bluff than it took the Willie Handcar Company to go the 1,300 miles to Salt Lake. The Willie Handcar Company made an average of 15 miles per day, even with all their difficulties. The Hole in the Rock, their total average was 1.6 miles per day. I have a friend, an acquaintance, he's since passed away, by the name of Montel Seeley, and some of you have probably seen the Castle Dell pageant. He wrote that pageant, and he was a man who was very comfortable in a wagon, covered wagon, or pulling a handcart. And he called me one day. He told me that he was a descendant of Hole in the Rock pioneers. And it was right after the sesquicentennial celebrations of the pioneers coming to the Salt Lake Valley. And during that celebration, he had built a handcart, and he had pulled his little handcart the 1,300 miles to Salt Lake during this celebration. And he was in his 70s at the time. And he called me after this experience and said, Lamont, I would like to take my handcart from Escalante to Bluff, and I want to live off the land. I want to know where all the springs are. So I met with him and gave him maps and told him about the springs I was aware of. And When he got to Bluff a couple of weeks after he began, he called me again and he said, Lamont, pulling a handcart the 1,300 miles from winter quarters to Salt Lake was a walk in the park. Now I have had a real pioneering experience. Now with respect to Platt D. Lyman, Platt D. Lyman, as you study his life, find him to be a very remarkable man. He married Adelia Robinson at the age of 19, and within days left for his first European mission. Then I believe he was 27 years old when he was called again to England on another mission. And when he returned at the age of 29, he was called as the Bishop of Oak City. And then just a few years later, he was called to help preside over the San Juan mission and the journey to Bluff. Now, as you know, by the mid-1870s, one of the only major sections in the state of, or in the territory of what would become the state of Utah was the southeastern section. There had been attempts to colonize the area with the Oak Mountain Mission as early as 1856, but they had failed. When the church initiated the plan to establish a settlement somewhere in that area, the people who were to provide the missionaries were from the western portions of the state. Erastus Snow, the general authority assigned to the project, sent a letter to the participants, and he outlined the primary objectives. And these are his statements. Settle the unoccupied territories that the saints might have a place to dwell. And there's some real significance in that. There had been some tremendous success in the southern states just prior to this. And prior to Brigham Young's death, he proposed that rather than the converts coming to Salt Lake and then being dispersed to various locations in the territory, if they were already from a southern climate, that they were to go directly to a southern climate and not come clear up to Salt Lake. And there was some great successes in the southern missions a couple of years prior to the Hole in the Rock. So much so that over 100 converts headed for the Four Corners area, but there was no settlement there yet. They planned to go on down into the Little Colorado area of Arizona, but the saints there sent reports that there wasn't enough water there to support them. So they didn't know where to go. They didn't dare continue into Utah. So they negotiated a deal with the governor of Colorado and ended up occupying or establishing Manassas, Colorado. So there was a need. In fact, Silas S. Smith was assigned to preside over those saints, as well as Platt D. Lyman. So there was a real urgent need to establish a settlement somewhere within the territory that could accommodate these people. The other objective that Erastus Snow defined was to establish a missionary labor amongst the Utes and the Navajos. In December of 1878, the first calls were issued during state conferences, and the first ones were issued in the Parowan Meeting House. I don't know that we can fully appreciate the challenge of going to a state conference and learning that you've been asked to participate in a colonization endeavor, to go to sell what you have, to go to some unknown region. You know, when I think of moving, I think of buying a new house in an established portion of the country. When they moved to a new unoccupied territory, there was nothing. Their livelihood, their lives depended on getting crops in immediately and being successful with those crops, or all would be lost. So I just can't imagine the difficult challenge of accepting a call like that. One sister, Jody Woods, as you know, she became the midwife in Bluff. She had a feeling that her family was going to be called, so she stayed home from conference. And she was called, and eventually they did go. Silas S. Smith, cousin to the prophet Joseph Smith, was called to preside over the journey, and shortly after arriving, he was called as the stake president for the people in Bluff, the surrounding communities, as well as these people in Colorado. The big question was where to settle specifically and how to get there. Silas S. Smith, in April of 1879, led an exploring expedition that crossed the Colorado River at Lee's Ferry, the only established crossing at that time, and then cut through the Navajo Nation. As soon as they were out of the Navajo territory, they looked for a possible place for a settlement. They established land claims along the San Juan River, and then they followed the old Spanish trail clear up towards Castledale through what's called Salina Pass and back to Cedar City. That journey was well over 1,000 miles. It took 5 months. Now, it's interesting, there's lots of speculation as to why they didn't take the southern route. 2 years prior to that exploration, the mission president then in Moenkopi, Arizona, amongst the Indians there, was asked to go meet with the heads of the Navajo Nation to see how they felt about a Mormon community coming in their area. And so James Brown met with what was one of the primary clansmen. There wasn't just one chief over the entire Navajo Nation, and his name was Bastine. And he said to President Brown, just wait a few minutes here on my property. I'm going to send messengers out and invite the other Maine clansmen to come. So within a few days, he had 13 other Maine clansmen of the Navajo Nation, as well as 200 other participants come to this meeting. And Chief Bastine presented what it was that James Brown was asking, which was, how do you feel about a Mormon community coming amongst your people? And they powwowed together, and their conclusion and what they told President Brown was, you're welcome to come as neighbors, but we do not have enough water. You cannot use our springs. That right there completely eliminated the southern route for the Maine mission. The explorers went that route. They just had a small group. They had to negotiate and pay for the use of some springs, and in some cases they had to make new ones. And in a few spots they almost lost their lives. So taking the southern route was absolutely out of the question. It was totally against what the Navajo leaders' wishes. Now, while Silas S. Smith is doing all of this exploring, Platt D. Lyman goes to General Conference in April of 1879. And he talks to the leaders of the church, and he said, we're having a very difficult time in Oak City. There's just not enough water to support the people there. How would you feel about me being released as the bishop and going elsewhere with my family? And while he was there, Erastus Snow heard about this, met with him, and asked him how would he feel about taking his family over to the Colorado River. Now, they hadn't decided for sure on the San Juan River yet. The explorers weren't back, but it was going to be somewhere in that area. And Platt D. Lyman said, I will be glad to go wherever the church would like me to go, provided I get an honorable release as bishop. Otherwise, I will stay right here in Oak City. Well, they gave him that honorable release. And then in August 1879, he gets a letter calling him to be Silas S. Smith's assistant to head the group of people to the San Juan River, there in the Four Corners area. Platt D. Lyman was accompanied by several of his extended family members and brothers and sisters, and in one case, a sister-in-law. Now, calls seldom come at a convenient time. That certainly was the case for Platt D. Lyman. A few months prior to this call being received, and now the call is received towards the end of August. Silas S. Smith isn't even back from that exploring expedition yet. And they're preparing to leave to go on this mission to the San Juan area. And they're looking at leaving as soon as they can sometime in the fall. Silas S. Smith, Platt D. Lyman's sister, earlier that spring, died a few days or about a week after giving birth to her first child, Joseph Callister. And Platt D. Lyman and his dear wife took that child in, and his dear wife took care of that baby, and they raised that child because the father died, I think it was in December of that same year. Now, if you've ever gone to the Bluff Fort, there's a large monument of all of the names of the Hole in the Rock participants. This baby, we realized, Joseph Callister, that was raised by the Lymans and taken to Bluff, and he grew up in that area. We left him off that plaque. So we realized the mistake, and his name has now been added to the plaque, because we were not just including those who went through the initial Hole in the Rock, because Platt D. Lyman's wife did not initially come with him. They came about a year later. But we rectified that, and he's now on the plaque. So Adelia, Platt D. Lyman's wife, is caring for this baby. And 3 weeks prior to his departure, their 1.5-year-old daughter dies. And that was their third child to die within 3 years. And Adelia is expecting Albert R. Lyman at the time. She's 5 or 6 months along. And so in accepting this call, it means Platt D. Lyman is likely not even going to be around when she delivers. So you can understand why she stayed home. And also, 3 or 4 weeks prior to his departure, Platt D. Lyman accepts the principle of plural marriage at the time and marries Annie Clark. She also remained there behind, I'm guessing, to help Adelia. After Platt D. Lyman gets back, they gather everyone in a state conference, and Smith, these are notes from that state conference. It says that Silas S. Smith persuaded the people not to go via the Navajo Nation. He understood the issues there, and the original intent must have been to go that way because there was already a ferry. So he convinces them we can't go that way. And he announces that the decision is made to go via Salina Pass. So that's their plan. They're going to take the Salina Path route, clear up through the old Spanish Trail. Now, the old Spanish Trail was not a wagon road at the time. The first people who took that route into Moab had to lower their wagons over a cliff that you can still see just east of the entrance of Arches National Park. So it was no easy route, and they would need a ferry on the Colorado River at what is now Moab. They would also need a ferry on the Green River. Now, something must have happened at this state conference, and I'm guessing that's when the Escalante people met with Silas S. Smith and said, and we're not sure who all said it, but we know at least Charles Hall was part of it, who lived in Escalante. He had discovered that there was a location on the Colorado River where there were no rapids, that though very difficult to get to, you could get to it. And it was about 60 miles east of Escalante. The problem was there was no time for any additional explorations. Many of the people had already sold homes and farms. They needed to be off immediately. But based on that, they made the decision to take the Escalante route, even though it had only been explored up to the Colorado River. This appeared in the newspaper on October 15th. For those going to San Juan, the intention of the company to take the route through Salina Pass has changed. The reason is the scarcity of any feed along the way, and the new road across the Colorado will shorten the distance some 200 miles. Silas S. Smith went on to say, the direct route will be a great benefit, not only to the San Juan people, but also to the people in Arizona and New Mexico. So that's the background of the decision. And on October 26th, they began their journey. Some people have speculated or been critical, why so late? Well, that was normal. These were farmers. They traveled during the winter to get to a destination in time to plant their spring crops. Plus, you wouldn't want to travel in the heat with your teams down in that area. Their first major task was to go over the Escalante Mountains. There was already a little bit of snow on the top of them, and that was the only possible way you could get to Escalante at the time. From Escalante, which was the last major settlement along the route, and I'm guessing that may have also contributed to the decision. Escalante was in their back door with respect to where they're going. There are some resources there. There's people there. There are some people who can build a ferry. There are log timbers up in the mountains. Had they gone the other route, they would have had a tremendous distance to go, 400 or 500 miles to get to the Moab area, and then they still got to build a ferry. So there were some other advantages of this route, primarily the town of Escalante and the resources to build a ferry, and Charles Hall knew how to do that. The Escalante Desert was flanked on one side by the Colorado River, the Escalante River, and on the other side by the Caparowitz Plateau. They headed out in the Escalante Desert towards what became 40 Mile Spring. Their route was initially quite easy and easily traversed. The specific route was chosen based on watering holes, such as 10 Mile Spring, 20 Mile Spring, Coyote Hose, and then 40 Mile Spring. This is 40 Mile Spring. 40 Mile Spring soon grew to a population of 250 men, women, and children, and over 85 wagons. And this is where Dance Hall Rock is located. They did enjoy themselves, even though they had a difficult journey. Now, Platte D. Lyman was assigned, when they got to Dance Hall Rock, they asked Platte D. Lyman to take 13 men, including my great-grandfather, with him to the Colorado River to cross it and explore for the first time the terrain on the east side. These 13 men across the Colorado River used a wagon box to make a makeshift boat. And they encountered for the first time what became known of as the hole, or the hole in the rock, a natural crevice. This crevice had an sheer drop-off, initial drop-off, so they found a different way to get down to the river called Jackass Bench. Now they crossed the they first went down the Colorado River to see if they could get down to the San Juan and go up it. They couldn't do that. They went up what's called Cottonwood Canyon, which is right across from the hole, and they made it. And then they went all the way down to the San Juan River again, and they went as far as what they believe is the area called the Chute. Platte D. Lyman and these other 12 men came back, reported to Silas S. Smith what they had discovered. And they were quite discouraged. Platte D. Lyman didn't feel it was possible to continue on, or that there would be any use in taking this route. And the clerk, Charles Walton, recorded that the summary of the scouts was that the terrain was so difficult it was not fit for a bird to fly over it. I think that's the best description of it I have ever come across. Now they faced a tremendous dilemma. What did they do? It's too late to choose another route. It has taken 6 weeks just to reach 40 Mile Spring. Many of them have already sold their farms and homes. If they go back, everybody would certainly understand and relatives would accommodate them, but it would be the end of the mission with this group of people anyway. They faced 3 major problems. First, the Escalante Mountain. The snow was starting to come onto the higher elevations of the Escalante Mountain. Now, some people speculate that they had no choice but to go on because the return was blocked. The return wasn't blocked. Silas S. Smith went back. The issue with the Escalante Mountain was if it became totally blocked, they wouldn't be able to get the blasting powder over it. They had to have blasting powder if they were going to continue. So one issue is the Escalante Mountain. If it becomes totally blocked, they're in big trouble because they've got to get supplies over it. Another issue is the Colorado River. They put a lot of faith in Charles Hall. Could he really make a ferry? Could they get wagons on the ferry and from one side of the river, 350-foot wide river, to the other side and hit the landing before it went downstream too far? And all would be lost. So the ferry had to work. And then the rest of the unexplored territory that they had no idea what was out there. So they send out explorers. Before they did that, of course, they had a meeting, and in this meeting, they discussed all of their options. Now, when they called for a sustaining vote, it was very different back then than it is today. Now, when a leader in your area or a church leader asks for a sustaining vote, they've already prayerfully made a decision, and they're presenting the decision of your presiding officers, and you're voting to sustain them or the person being called to a call. Back then, it was a literal vote, and anyone could propose an alternative. Even state presidents were that way. If somebody, when they proposed that a new state president was called, anyone could propose another name. And whoever got the most votes was the new state president. And there were times when the standing state president would lose the vote, and it was called lost the vote. So it was very different back then, and we have no record of anyone not voting to move on. They all wanted to go on and complete their mission. So even though they had those three major obstacles to overcome, they voted to go on. And that's where Jens Nilsson made that famous statement, if we have plenty of stickity to duty, we cannot fail. Now I'm going to speed way up, get you to the Colorado River in the next 5 minutes or so. This just gives you a glimpse of what I think is some of the difficulties of the journey. And there are certainly some unsung heroes, particularly the women. You know, they had to take care of their children in extremely difficult situations while the men were out having a ball blowing up rocks, you know. And the center is the hole in the rock. The hole in the rock had some huge challenges. That 40-foot drop at the top. Two sections in the middle of it that were too narrow for wagons, and the bottom was too steep to control the wagons. In the meantime, they send out scouts to explore all the way, and the scouts were anticipated to be out for 15 days. It took them 15 days to get just a little over halfway, and they were lost on Christmas Eve without any food. They used up their last flour to make a flapjack and shared it. And they were desperately looking for a landmark. The next morning they climbed the knoll to the side there, the Salvation Knoll, and from there they could see the Elk Mountains, the Blue Mountains, which gave them an orientation for their destination. They eventually got back, decided that there was a possible way through that was going to be very difficult. In the meantime, they're working on the crevice through the hole in the rock. There are sections in the hole in the rock where they had to raise the natural bottom by 8 feet because the walls were too narrow to allow passage of the wagon. That entire section of wall there in the center of the screen, those are pick marks where they're widening that section. And the bottom is too steep to control their wagons, so they literally attack the road on the side of the cliff by widening a natural ledge, drilling in holes, and literally attacking the road on the side of the cliff called Uncle Ben's Dugway. The top of the hole in the rock was blasted out. There's one of the blast holes that's still seen, and that's the section they blasted out. A glimpse of what must have been a very challenging endeavor to blast that crevice, or that road through the crevice, which took 6 weeks. On January 26, 1880, they began their descent, and you've all heard the story. The first team brought forth, and they apparently gave the honor to Benjamin Perkins because he was the engineer in the hole in the rock, and he passed the honor to, I believe, his brother. However, if you read Miller's book, I think there's at least 6 men that take credit for driving the first wagon down. So we're not quite sure who drove the first wagon down, but the first team would not go. They could see down that crevice and they would not budge. But fortunately, somebody had 2 blind horses, and the blind horses didn't know any better. And after they went down, the other teams could pick up the scent of the first one and gave them some courage. Illustration of the man hanging behind the wagons to help slow it down during the initial descent. And those are our children, now all grown up. Now, Charles Hall was the one who built the ferry. The ferry was large enough to accommodate 2 wagons. When they launched the ferry, it would be the currents would take it downstream. They'd tie teams on it, pull it back up, so that it would land back at their original starting point. The ferry worked. This is one that matches the description, though this is not a photo of it, but it does match the description of what Charles Hall built, with the help of almost every man in Escalante. Now, the work really begins. This is Cottonwood Canyon. Cottonwood Canyon is a box canyon. They've got to come up with what's called Cottonwood Hill. And the Cottonwood Hill is divided into the dugway, the little hole in the rock, and then they've reached that kind of territory. They've just now reached the area that Platt D. Lyman considered as impassable. They continue through this, that's the chute. They work over Gray Mesa. Olivia Larson goes into labor on Gray Mesa and gives birth to a healthy boy. That's the second baby born en route. And coming down Gray Mesa, they've got to work blast switchbacks down the slick rock, called slick rocks, solid sandstone. You can see all the blasting work there. Then they cross Death Valley, Lake Pagaret, now washed away, but they crossed on the dam at the time. Castle Wash, then they've got a 1,300-foot drop down Clay Hill Pass. Then they've got to work their way around Grand Gulch, which requires them to move to a higher elevation into junipers and cedars. They chop down trees for 20 miles. You can still see some of those tree stumps out there. Now they're on what's called Cedar Mesa. The Cedar Mesa has no easy way down. It's these kind of canyons all the way around it. They find that following the Anasazi Trail, they work their way down what's called the Twist. Then they've got Comb Ridge, their last major barrier. To get up Comb Ridge, they built the road up San Juan Hill. By now, their teams are completely worn out. That's an actual axle and wagon wheel that's still out on the trail. 7 span of horses. That's 14 horses or oxen to pull one wagon. Nobody had that many, so those poor animals would have to make multiple trips. Jens Nilsson, one of his teams, died going up San Juan Hill. That's where, if you recall, the rocks were covered with blood from the forelegs of the struggling teams. Then on April 4th, 1880, they arrive in the Bluff Valley. They designated April 6th as the formal arrival date to coincide with the celebrations of the Restoration, with the organization of the church. Now, Jens Nilsson's daughter was not impressed. This is the worst place I have ever seen. Is this where we're going to stay? And he said, "Why, yes, where did you want to go?" Now, Sarah Williams was not a member of the church when she went on this. She came along to help care for her sister's children. she said the following: "I didn't see anything to stop for, nor could I see it possible to make a town in such a place. How thankful I was that I did not have to make my home there." But she was also impressed with the people. The unity among the people coming out with no conveniences. And yet they were just as happy as they could be. It was on the trip out to Bluff that my eyes began to be opened. The things began to come a little at a time. The singing had as much to do with it as any one thing, and the preaching of Platt Lyman. Now, Platt D. Lyman apparently took from his father, because I've read that Platt D. Lyman eventually became known as the most eloquent speaker in the church at the time. Sarah Williams joined the church, was baptized in the San Juan River, and then headed home, left Bluff. Wasn't long before she was back in Bluff, became the plural wife of Benjamin Perkins. And Sarah Williams is in this photograph with her 10 children, her sons in the background on the porch. Her first daughter, Mary Ellen, is who Albert R. Lyman married. Now, they were successful in establishing a road that they could use for bidirectional travel for 1 full year, and then they bypassed the hole in the rock with Hall's Crossing and continued to use that until 1884, when massive floods washed all ferries down the river. The hole in the rock route, a mistake or an advantage? If you look at the results versus the difficulty of the journey, I think it's very clear that it was a great success. We shouldn't judge one's success based on how difficult it was to become successful. We judge it on the results. There were no deaths or serious mishaps. They adhered to the Navajos' desires. They only needed 1 ferry instead of 2. They were close to Escalante and those resources. It reduced future travel time for supplies and to visit families by several weeks. They developed great unity. They were tempered. It tempered the participants for the challenges ahead. I like what Cumin Jones said: 6 months amidst one of the most severe in the midst of one of the most severe winters. It looks to me like there was something more than human power or wisdom associated with it. Surely the hand of providence had been over the traveling pilgrims, and I switched the slide too soon. If you have plenty of stickity-tooty, you cannot fail. Now, one last concluding thing. I think it was at a presentation 5 years ago to the Lymans. A young man at the end of it, after I explained their successes, asked me, well, what came of it? And I talked about developing firm relations with the Utes and the Navajos and establishing Blanding and Monticello and supporting those saints in Colorado. And he kept saying after that, well, what else came of it? And then it hit me. What came of it? What came of our ancestors, your ancestors' difficult trials, is you. And that's the most important part of what they accomplished. Thank you, brothers and sisters. Any questions?
Where did they get the material at that point to build the ferry?
Okay, the ferry material, the Escalante Mountains, right in the back door of Escalante, had a sawmill. And so they built the ferry at Escalante and in a prefabricated form, then dismantled it, hauled it to the hole, and put it back together.
So did it travel with them on the initial journey, or did they go back for it?
No, while they were building the road through the hole in the rock is when they were building the ferry in Escalante. So sometime before they crossed is when the people in Escalante brought out the ferry. And I didn't mention, there are some other unsung heroes, those who crossed the Escalante Mountain in those deep snows to bring in the blasting powder. That had to have been quite an ordeal. That in itself would make quite a movie, I believe. It's too bad we don't even know who those men were.
Did they take the pieces of the ferry down the hole in the rock?
Yes, they assembled it at the bottom. Well, they used that when it arrived. They were already the hole in the rock road was well enough established, so that they didn't have to use jackass match anymore. Yes.
Do you have any documentation as to just when the marriage with Lamont Crabtree took place? I can't see when he had time.
Well, Family Search has a date. It was just 4 weeks before he left. So, but Family Search does have their marriage date.
You might want to know that my wife's great-grandfather was the oldest one in the party. His name was Roswell Stevens. He was 70 years old, and he was the first person to die in Bluff.
Yes, Roswell Stevens was the oldest person, and it's great we've got a descendant of him here. And he was the first one to die just a few weeks, I believe, after they arrived in Bluff. And there was no timber to make his coffin, so they made his coffin out of his wagon box that brought him to Bluff, as I understand it. Anything else?
I think I read Jens Nelson was also on a handcart company
Yes.
and was older. Maybe that's why he gave this opinion. But he said this was more severe to him.
Yes, he did. Jens Nilsson was part of the Willie Handcart Company. He was the chaplain for the Hole in the Rock expedition and the first bishop in Bluff. And he said, wrote it down, that the journey of the Hole in the Rock was more difficult than what he experienced. That he experienced a horrible ordeal. His only son at the time died in the Willie Handcart trip, and he became so crippled he had begged his wife to leave him along the trail on the Willie journey, and she refused, and they loaded him in the handcart, and she pulled him to the rescue teams, and he was partially crippled the rest of his life from that. Anything else? I think it's, yes. One. Let's see, you mean as far as the Silas S. Smith and, yeah. Well, he was called as the chaplain, so his responsibility was, I guess, the religious welfare. And then one of the remarkable things, my time's over, but one of the remarkable challenges that Platt v. Lyman had, I didn't make this clear, Silas S. Smith left after they decided to go on at 40 Mile Spring. He was a member of the state legislature. He went back to Salt Lake to raise funds and to get the blasting powder and the man. And he got sick back there. So he did not rejoin them until they arrived at Bluff. So this 32-year-old young man, Platt v. Lyman, was in charge of the entire journey. When they arrived at Bluff, Bluff had been designated as one of the land claim areas. But there was not enough property. When they looked at the size of the lots they felt they needed to support a family, it could only support 2/3 of the company. And the rest would have to move up to Montezuma Fort. But they were united and they were tired and they didn't want to go anywhere. They all wanted to stay together, but there just wasn't enough land. So they drew lots. They drew lots to see who could stay in Bluff, who would have to leave. Platt v. Lyman drew a blank lot. He would be one of the ones who would have to go along with another third of the company. But the people that drew blank lots didn't want to leave. They were too tired. They wanted to stay. So another man proposed, let's just divide the land equally, we'll have smaller lots. They asked for a sustaining vote, and it didn't carry. And so Platt D. Lyman was in an awkward situation, because he had a blank lot. But he negotiated over a 3-day period with the people, and eventually someone else proposed, and it may have been him. Let's throw in the land claims that were made by the earlier explorers the year before. That was one advantage of being an explorer. You could make the first land claim. And they made some big land claims. If they will give up their land claims, then let's all divide it equally. And that carried. And that's what they did. All right, thank you so much.